When we come back, stick around. All right, let's talk about speeding on the show now. Everybody has got an opinion on this one. Are the speed limits in British Columbia too low? Is that why the cops like to stake out their favorite fishing holes to nail driver after driver to raise revenue from all those speeding tickets? Or, hey, maybe the speeding limits are too high. We got to lower those speed limits to get people to slow down because speed kills. Everybody knows that, right? Let's check in with Ian Tootill now from SENSE BC. Hey, Ian.
Hi, Mike.
Hey, man. Thanks a lot for coming on, because last week we talked about this on the show with Steve Wallace, the very fine driving instructor in Victoria, and we talked about the battle over speed limits and how some politicians are saying we should lower the speed limits on some roads, especially some urban roads. What do you think about that idea? I mean, should politicians, do you think, be getting involved in setting speed limits at all?
You know, Mike, before I answer that question, I just want to get it out there that I've not got a lot of interest in seeing anything change on a municipal level. I mean, by and large, speed limits in municipalities work well, and that's, you know, we have no issue with them. But as you know, I always like to come on your show and talk about highway speed limits in BC, and yes, many of those limits should be adjusted on the upside. I think we've had that conversation in the past. The issue that Steve was talking about last week was this ongoing discussion about whether or not municipal speed limits should be dropped from 50K to 40K.
Right.
And whether or not politicians should have any impact on or in that discussion, or even, you know, be deciding what those speed limits should be. And as you know, I have some opinions about that. I think the politicians have far too much impact on what should be left to the engineers. We had an example in Vancouver a couple of years ago where Vancouver City Council decided that it was appropriate to drop the Hastings speed limit to 30 kilometers an hour to accommodate the people that were jaywalking all over that stretch of road. They were told by the Vancouver police that it wasn't a good idea and that it wouldn't work, but they went ahead and did it anyway. And so this came up again in Victoria last year, and it was put before the UBCM and it failed. But these two councillors don't accept the failure, and they keep pushing it.
Okay, I agree with you, Ian, that I think the politicians should stay out of it. It should be based on the science of the traffic flow and the engineering detail of a particular stretch of highway, right? The flow of traffic and the speed in that traffic should match what can safely be accommodated on any particular highway. But you generally think that the speed limits are too low, right?
On some highways, Mike. I've got little issue with municipal roadways. I mean, there are some main arteries that could be adjusted on the upside because it's quite obvious the roads are built for higher speeds, and that's what traffic does on those roads. But in Victoria, the conversation has been about dropping the 50K limit to 40K.
Right.
And what we say is that, well, first of all, politicians shouldn't be the ones to have that discussion except under exceptional circumstances. But in the cases where it is being had, first of all, what you have to do is examine whether or not you've got a problem in the first place. And I'm going to assert that in Victoria, you don't have a problem. If you look at the engineering report, you can see that many of the roads, the neighborhood roads, which is what Councillor Gudgeon and Issett are talking about, those roads don't have high speeds on them anyways. And there's not an issue with injuries and fatalities in Victoria. So what are they really trying to address? What I assert they're trying to do is assert some sort of social change on people. But when you do things like that, there's an economic and human consequence to it, and it's not always positive.
Okay. Speaking of accidents and injuries, this is the issue that we're all really concerned about, Ian. And generally, talk about speed traps for a minute, because in my experience and a lot of people I talk to, the police will have their favorite fishing holes, right, where they will go, they will set up, and they can just nail speeder after speeder, because I think in some of those areas the road geometry doesn't match the speed limits. The issue you've been talking about for years. The problem is that a lot of those places where they write a lot of speeding tickets, those are not the places where they're having accidents.
Right.
Am I right there? I mean, why don't they redeploy the traffic cops and put them in areas where people are actually having crashes and accidents.
Well, one of the consequences of creating speed limits which are not reflective of the reasonable actions of the reasonable majority is that you create a number of lawbreakers. And the police do what the police do. They're not there to make the laws, they're there to enforce them. So they go out and they choose the areas where they see people flagrantly disobeying the laws. Now, to their credit, most of the time, many times, they will make adjustments or allowances for what the traffic flow seems to be doing. But the reality is that if you're unfortunate enough to end up in court with one of those arbitrary tickets that you got in some of those areas, if you're going 1 mile an hour or 1 kilometer an hour over the limit in the eyes of the law, you're breaking the law and you get a ticket and a fine and points. And you can lose your license because of that. And so it's not appropriate to do this. And yes, you're right. In many cases, in some cases, the police do find what we call fishing holes, and those are places where people go faster than the sign says that they should be. But in many cases, it's perfectly safe to do that. Now, I listened to your show last week, and I think your last caller on there talked about the Granville Bridge. The Granville Bridge is a bone of contention for me because the police sit at the south end of the bridge, and they target drivers coming over the hump of the bridge where the speed limit is 60, but because of the geometry of the bridge, the flow of the traffic, the fact that there's limited, or there are no exits and entrances on the bridge in that stretch, so people go faster. They go 70, 80 kilometers an hour over the hump of the bridge. Now, when you talk to the VPD about why they're doing it, they're saying two things. We're targeting lawbreakers, and we're trying to improve safety in high crash areas. Well, where are the high crash areas? They're at the intersections towards Broadway and Granville. But by the time the drivers hit Broadway and Granville, they've slowed down. So they can't stand there and ticket people, so they've got to be on the Granville Bridge. And they're doing it primarily, I think, just for visibility and just to, sometimes beef up the coffers. Municipalities in BC now get a portion of the ticket fine revenue, and right. I think that's another issue that needs to be dealt with.
Okay, here's what we'll do, Ian. I'm going to jump in there. We'll take a break. Back with more with Ian Tootill. Call me up on this because last week we talked about it. We got lots of calls on this, so people always want to have their say on speeding. Do you think that the speed limits are too high, too low? Do you think speed is out of control on our highways? How about fishing holes, some of those speed traps that the cops love to set up at it? Do you know about any of those? What are some of the most notorious speed traps that you're aware of in BC? I'd love to hear from you and your experience. Call me up, 604-280-9898 is the number to call. Toll free all around BC. It's 1-877-399-9898, star 9898 on your cell. CKNW on Facebook and Twitter as well. Your calls after this. All right, welcome back. Talking about speed limits in BC with my guest, Ian Tootill from SENSE BC. Taking your calls as well, 604-280-9898 is the number to call me. Toll free all around BC, 1-877-399-9898, star 9898 on your cell. Have your say on Facebook and Twitter as well. On the CKNW Facebook page right now, Marissa writes, a first speeding offense, you should have re-education classes. Second speeding offense, classes and a fine. Third offense, classes, a fine, and a suspension of your license. If people want to act like irresponsible children behind the wheel of a 2-ton machine, then treat them like children. Ian Tootill, what do you say about that? Would be some pretty heavy-handed punishment.
Yeah, well, I'd agree with that person if the speed limits had integrity to them. It's hard to believe that somebody who's a driver would write that. If she spent any time on the highways in BC and she drove with everybody else at the flow of traffic, which is generally above the posted speed limits, then she wouldn't be saying that.
What's going on with the government's review of speed limits? What's the status of that?
That's a good question. I've sent a note over to the minister a couple of weeks ago to ask, but we were told some months ago to expect some news at the end of May. So right now, that's all we know. Okay,
well, we're waiting for that. 604-280-9898. Call me up and tell me what you think. Let's go to Gary on the open line. Hey, Gary.
Yes, good morning.
Hi.
How you doing?
Yeah, go ahead.
So I'm with the person that posted to the Facebook. I drive the highways. I spent 37 years driving a city bus in Vancouver. I've retired to BC's north. And you take your life in your hands when you're out on the road. People that flagrantly disobey the speeding rules, the laws, they have no common sense, and I think they should be taken off the road. You don't need to drive 120, 130 K up the Coquihalla or along the number one between Surrey and Hope, and I presume that that's one of the areas that they think they could raise the speed limit. You don't need to drive 120 or at 130 K. You're going to get there quicker, but not much quicker. And what are you going to do when you get there anyway? People don't need to drive any quicker than they are.
Okay, Ian, what do you say to Gary?
Well, Gary drives the city bus, and I don't know what his other vehicle is, or even if he has another vehicle, but I get into conversations with truckers quite a bit about what appropriate highway speed limits are, and there's a disagreement about, with some of them. The ones that are paid by a company generally like to see the speeds lower, and the ones that work for themselves like to see them a bit higher, but people that drive bigger vehicles are not in a position to drive much faster, and there's no problem. They can drive whatever speed they want, just stay right. But I'm not the person who is making the decision. We've always said the decision should be left to the engineers. It shouldn't be left to the politicians, shouldn't be left to the public, and it shouldn't be left to bus drivers or truck drivers. It should be left to the engineers. And if we had engineering-based decisions in British Columbia, the speed limits on the highways would make a lot more sense than they do sometimes.
Well, what about the two examples that he cited, the Coquihalla and the number one between Surrey and Hope?
Well, I would hope that the Coquihalla is probably the first highway at the top of their list that they end up adjusting the speed limit on. I haven't seen the numbers from the survey yet, but I'm guessing the 85th percentile probably rests around 125 to 130 on most of the stretches of the Coquihalla. So if that's the case, that should probably be what the speed limit is.
What's the speed limit there now?
It's 110.
110.
And speed limits on most highways in BC are anywhere from 80 to 100 kilometers.
Does anybody, to go back to Gary's original point, why does anyone need to drive 120K?
Well, why does anybody need to drive 100? I mean, we build roads for speed. This is the 21st century, and we move goods, services, and people as quickly and efficiently and safely as we can. And we spend a lot of money to build these high-speed roads so that we can do that. And if we don't want high-speed roads, then let's not build them. But if we build them, then we should use them. And there's a cost to not using them, and there's a cost to punishing people for using them as they're meant to build, or as they're built for driving.
Okay, here's what we'll do. I'll jump in there, Ian. We'll take another break, come back with more calls. Also, keep sending me your comments on Facebook and Twitter. Brian tells me on Facebook, proper driving training is what we need to replace the feeble system we have now. Private driving instructors are a large part of the problem. Facebook and Twitter is the place to post your comments, and phone me on the open line, 604-280-9898, star 9898 on your cell. More of your calls next. All right, welcome back. Talking speed limits with Ian Tootill. Call me up, 604-280-9898. Have your say on Facebook and Twitter. On Facebook, Rex says defensive driving is the way to go, not necessarily cracking down with a new speed limit. 604-280-9898. Let's go to Bob in the open line. Hey, Bob.
Mike and Ian, this is about realistic speed limits. If you go across the Oak Street Bridge and set your cruise control and have the passenger count the cars that pass you from the bridge to the border, and then you go across the border and do the same thing, can you guess where the cars pass?
Now you tell me.
Well, it's obvious. Here, it's like I'm standing still.
Yeah.
Once you hit the border where they have realistic speed, like you can go up to 120, I actually pass cars, and I've got set at the limit. Here, when I'm set at 60, they're going past me. If you've never done the experiment, try it. It's staggering.
The speed limits are higher in Washington State?
And they enforce them.
Oh, yes, I know. Ian, what about that, Washington State?
Well, it's not just Washington. It's all over the U.S. And since 1996, when the 55-mile-an-hour federally mandated limit was removed, Most of the U.S. states have since raised their limits. Many of them have raised them more than once, as they've found that the negative consequences that were screamed about by the special interest groups for years didn't unfold. So the U.S. is showing us how it's done. Canada's still sort of dragging its feet a little bit, but I'm pretty confident that we're not too far away from where they are.
Let's go to Alex on the open line. Hi, Alex. What do you think?
Hey, Mike. I'm a true believer that the speed limits that are posted are just archaic and built for older machines, and they just don't jive with today's technology. And I also believe that drivers that drive slow get bored and they become distracted. That's why they're texting, doing their makeup, and whatnot. But I'm just a true believer that these speed limits need to go up, especially because of the technology we have.
Ian Tootill.
Well, I don't like to get into a discussion about things I don't know a lot about, but my intuition tells me that latter statement is correct. When you used to look at single-car collisions on the Coquihalla, the number one cause of single-car collisions on the Coquihalla used to be falling asleep at the wheel, fatigue. And I know when I drive on the Coquihalla at 110, my attention tends to wander, and I tend to find other things to do. When I'm driving at the speed that the road is designed for, which is a higher speed than that, I tend to focus more on my driving. But I can't prove it.
Okay, speaking of the mind wandering, what about distracted driving? We only got a minute left. I think they should crack down there. What do you think?
Well, again, it doesn't do us a lot of good to come out and oppose laws against distracted driving, because nobody wants distracted driving. We all drive. We want safety. We don't want people texting and driving. The question is whether there's a better way of dealing with things. And I think that if you create a proper driving culture where people do pay attention, and they have to pay attention, and you educate them properly, and you tighten up the driving license procedure for getting a license, maybe you don't need the law. Maybe you don't need to have police standing at intersections ticketing people.
Ian, it's always a pleasure having you on. Thank you for coming on the show today.
Thanks a lot, Mike.
Ian Tootill, SENSE BC. If you didn't get through on the open line, call me on the listener line. Have your say there. 604-331-2784. 331-2784. Make sure you check out CKNW on Facebook and Twitter. Have your say there as well. Coming up next, why did the Vancouver School Board say no to a $475,000 corporate donation? It's next.